Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our next edition of our Intent-Based Leadership International podcast. Today, I'm joined by Ron Zmich, who's Senior Vice President at Palmer Holland and has been using intent-based leadership for at least, I think, the last 5 years. So, Ron, just tell us a little bit more about Palmer Holland, and then we're going to investigate and talk a little bit more about the use of intent-based leadership.
Good morning, and I appreciate you having me on the podcast. So Palmer Holland is a North American specialty chemical and fine ingredient distributor, serving a wide array of end use industrial markets as well as consumer and life sciences markets. So based in Cleveland, Ohio, currently covering North America, and actually just a few weeks ago celebrated our 100th birthday. So we had a centennial celebration. Been in business for 100 years.
And how many people in the overall business, Ron?
Approximately 240, probably more or less, maybe 2/3 based here at our corporate headquarters in Cleveland, and then the balance spread across the United States and Canada.
Okay, great. So I think it's probably about 5 or 6 years ago that you first contacted us and wanted to understand more about intent-based leadership. What was your original motivation, or what was the original engagement?
Yeah, so we put together a principal summit. We use in our vernacular, principal means supplier. So we put together a summit for a number of our key principals, C-suite type personnel. This is 2018. And we were looking for a speaker, and we evaluated a number of potential speakers, motivational, and some type of half-day workshop. And we ran across David. And the story was intriguing. I found the 9-10 minute little greatness animation clip. I read the book, turned the ship around. I said, "Yeah, I think this is the guy that we want." And had David come in and conduct a half-day workshop. And I just took to it. I've gone through, all kinds of, whether you want to call them trainings or seminars or workshops over the years, but there was something about IBL that just really resonated with me. So throughout 2019, I re-engaged with you guys and began to try to put together a program for the team that I was leading at the time, for 2020.
And what were your aspirations at that point? What were you thinking or hoping that working with intent might do for you and might benefit the team?
I was and still do lead a incredibly bright, capable, ambitious team, management team in particular. Looking back and looking in the mirror, partly my own doing, and maybe also a product of the culture at the time. And what I mean by that is hierarchy was enforced. As far as decision making, I had all these people that knew what they were doing more than I did, consistently coming to me and, "Hey, what do you think? And what do you think I should do?" And yeah, I had a lot of experience on my side, but, I thought, "Hey, I'm not going to be around forever. I can't be the answer man for everything. If we're going to grow this thing, it's slowing us down." So that's really what I said, "Man, I need to learn myself, from a leadership standpoint. How can I get this team to start taking action without having to run every last little decision, by me?"
Yeah, I guess in the context of your business, relationships are important. Having people checking in with you and saying, "What should I do about that?" from a customer perspective isn't necessarily going to be the optimal way of working.
Correct.
Certainly my experience of working with a team is a team of exceptionally bright and forward-thinking and go-getting team. But I guess that if they'd been used to or versed in, well, the decisions need to always go up and always need to get approved, and that's going to act as a blocker in terms of responsiveness to customers and so forth. I remember going back to 2020. One of the things that we talked about was how Palmer Holland could get ahead of the competition through your agility and scale. So the fact that you were probably slightly smaller than some of the competition gave you a big advantage, but that advantage needed to be realized by the way in which people were able to respond to the needs of customers.
Well stated. I don't think I can put it any better.
So what specific aspects of the intent-based approach do you think have had most resonance for you?
For me personally, I think I've looked at this from the standpoint of what seems to have really taken hold with the organization and maybe what has been more for me. And some of it overlaps. I have found myself asking many more questions than I ever did. And have really tried to be a student of asking better questions. Since we worked together in 2020, I ran across the famous Ted Lasso dart scene video, and I play it all the time at home. And my wife says, "Oh my God, you're watching that again." I was like, anytime I see it, I have to watch it. But for me, the questions as a leader, consistently working on creating clarity, very similar to some of what IBL preaches, CCD, clear, concise, direct. And while all important, I tell people I would take clarity every day, twice on Sunday, over concise and direct. Clarity is key. I have become acutely aware of anchoring conversations, although finding the time when I feel like I need to anchor the conversation. So it's not an all or none. And then I always did a pretty good job of this, but just becoming even more aware and more focused of speaking last as the leader of these teams. If I were to spill that over to what I've seen surface most with the team or the organization, we've made great strides both within the division that I look after and as a company as a whole, was creating psychological safety, which has been key. Again, getting back to that clarity piece, being clear about, the why is something that, I challenge our executive team, because it's easy to fall back into maybe bad habits, and, you scratch your head and you think you were crystal clear on something, and then something happens in the organization, and your immediate reaction is, you get upset, you get frustrated. And what I constantly point out is take a step back and I trace it back and say, listen, at the end of the day, that individual thought what they thought, they report to you or they report to me. So let's not be quick to judge, and rather say, clearly there was a misunderstanding somewhere. So as leaders, it's really falls to us to get better and better at creating clarity, as far as what we're seeking down through the company.
So that mechanism of the 3 C's of clarity, competence, in order to be able to give control, becomes a point of reference in discussions of what might be missing for us at this point, which is causing this discrepancy in understanding.
Yeah, it's the area that I feel, if we look at the 3 C's, it's the area that I feel as an organization we've made the most progress. But it's also the area that I think is easiest to fall prey to getting lazy or overlooking. I think a lot of leaders love to pride themselves on being empowering, and that's all well and good. But if there's not clarity that's coming with that, you can find yourself in some trouble.
Thinking about the practice of speaking last, what were some of the things that you noticed as a result of doing that?
I got much, much better at not, I got better at active listening. I got much better at not already formulating my opinion to what anybody individually was saying, and rather say, no, listen and let this get around the room. And, before really starting to, first of all, starting to come up with what I thought was the right thing to say in my role. But more importantly, making sure that I got as much information as I could. Inevitably, you learn something from everybody that might speak in a particular case or situation or environment. So allowing everybody to speak, not jumping to trying to formulate my thoughts or answers already, and therefore not listening to anybody else. But I think most importantly, yep, I picked up something from that. Oh, okay, that changes my thought a little bit. I picked up something from that person. That changes how I'm thinking a little bit. Or, then the situations too, where you get around the room and you say to yourself, all right, clearly we're aligned, in which case it doesn't really leave me in a position to say much of anything.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I guess also when you've heard from each of the people around the room, you're learning something, but also you're learning something about them in terms of their own competence and understanding and the clarity that they've got.
Yep.
I remember talking to somebody not too far away from you in Cleveland who said, her biggest surprise when she practiced speaking last was as much the ideas that came as a realization that her team were more competent than she had assumed. Sometimes what we find or what we hear is that when leaders start being conscious about asking better and open questions, one of the challenges can be, well, do we have time to do that? I'm interested in what your experience of that was. Did it add lots of time to business by practicing asking more open questions?
No, well, let me say this. I don't know that it added what I'd call time to meetings. Okay. I guess one could argue that we spend more time Yeah, I mean, spend more time. I mean, it's a good thing. Time that might have been invested elsewhere prior is now being spent in conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
Is what I would say. You know, to the extent that it's at the expense of, you know, quote unquote, getting your day job done or whatever you might need to do as far as the computer. Yeah, but I mean, to me, it's been a net positive with the amount of communication that takes place outside of meetings today. That yeah, it inevitably takes more time, but not appreciable, and I think it's well worth it.
Yeah, I think sometimes the challenge can be people can look at the practices like asking more open questions and think, well, yeah, I'm under a lot of pressure from a time perspective. But in reality, asking an open question compared to a closed question might add in, I don't know, a minute or 2 minutes into a conversation rather than let's just get it done. And the return comes at a later date when actually you don't need to go over what you thought had previously been discussed or explore a different option which wasn't talked about in the original conversation.
I think that's great advice, and I would say that that's borne out because the initially I think that the speculation or the assumption is we don't have time for this. So, messaging that I've pushed for the last 5 years is we have to intentionally practice this stuff. And when you hear intentionally practice, you think that's an ad, right? That's an ad to everything I'm doing right now. It's like, no, initially it may feel like an ad, and yeah, it may take a little bit longer. But it's not this, it's, it's, it's incremental. And with practice, naturally, you get better. It becomes more natural. It becomes more instinct. And it just becomes normal course of business. But I think that's a great point is, this assumption that, this is going to take so much longer if we really try to be intentional about working this way, about communicating with each other this way, when in reality, it really does.
Now, interested in terms of what you noticed around how, in you thinking about decisions which previously you may have been expected to make and decisions that you or the areas where you wanted decisions to be made faster or quicker, closer to the client. What examples do you have in terms of the impact of working with intent from a decision making perspective?
Great question. So I'm coming up on 19 years here, and we've had, and some of this, Peter. We've had explosive growth in my time here. When I first started here, small organization, and our CEO at the time preached, to our commercial team, this mantra: "Be your own CEO," which was great in some respects because it was all about pushing decision-making authority down to the individual contributor level, in this case, the sales team. What didn't necessarily come hand in hand with that back then were the other two C's, but the control piece was, and that was how we operated. And so we had that, we have that pedigree, that history. Well, as we grew and we added people, we added functions, you know, we swung all the way, not all the way, but we swung heavily back in the direction of, rightfully so, we created process, but what came with process was policy, and what came with policy was hierarchy. And so we saw that decision making, get pushed up, not intentionally, but it just, that's what surfaced. So when I sat and looked at what we do as a commercial team, or as a company, frankly, but we're a sales organization. So, and that's not to discount our operations side, because they're extremely important to what we do. But commercially, I looked and said, listen, 85% of this commercial decisions should be made at the account manager level. And north of 90 should be made at the regional sales manager level. And I felt very, very confident in that and trying to find a way to push back in that direction. Um, and we've had a lot of success over the last couple of years in doing just that. I would tell you that in my position, the only decisions, frankly, I make, short of recruiting, onboarding, hiring, terminating people that directly report to me, decisions that I would make as part of our executive team, not necessarily as the senior vice president of an industrial specialty. So it's been pretty neat pushing that down. I would tell you though, the biggest challenge we face and the biggest change because of our growth is, 15 years ago, salespeople could make decisions pretty quickly. They had the authority to do so. And when they were doing so, because of the size of the organization and we weren't as complex of a company, they had 70-80% of the information they needed to make a decision. Today, those dynamics have changed, and trying to instill a sense of, yeah, listen, it is your decision, but not in a vacuum. And, you need to be informing across the organization. You certainly ought to be seeking input from others in the organization, particularly on the operations side. Not to say it's their decision, but here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, 15 years ago at this stage, you might've had 70% of the information and felt pretty good about pulling the trigger on a decision. Now you probably have 30 or 40% of the information. You think you still have 70%, so I would say that's the biggest change. So it's great. We went from decisions being made at the individual contributor level, or, at the level where those that are closest to the information were making the decision. We moved arguably in the wrong direction. We've moved back appropriately in that direction. And then what we're working on the most these days is, again, we got to do a better job communicating across, asking for input. That's where we sit here today in 2025.
How is something like the ladder of leadership helped with that thinking or that progression of ensuring there's sufficient communication, that people aren't going off and doing whatever they think is right? Can you tell us a little bit more about that type of approach, or how the ladder might have helped with your thinking there?
Yeah. So a couple things that I've been clear on, from my standpoint with the team is, and just to, what I reinforce is, this isn't about getting everybody to operate at level 5 all the time. You're probably not going to get a single person operating at level 5 all the time with you in your downline, let alone everybody on your team. So let's start there. And similarly, I'd rather not have anybody ever operating on level 1. So reinforcing that, we're really going to pay attention to operating on level 1. And there's going to be some urgency in trying to move those individuals up the ladder. Or conversely, hey, look in the mirror and make sure that you're not falling victim to doing a good job of moving somebody on your team up the ladder. And then you just turn around and tell them what to do after they've told you what they think, or they're like, well, here, go do this. So that doesn't happen often, but no, the ladder has been great at getting, particularly newer members of our team, that come in, and maybe, aren't quite sure yet, how things go. But I think really pushing people to levels 2, ideally levels 3, and 4. One thing that has really been neat is washing out and I used to prescribe to this too, and if it wasn't for IBL, I probably still would, washing out the proverbial, ask for forgiveness, not permission. And that was a because we were the kind of organization we're like, listen, man, if you think it's in the right interest of the business, go ahead and do it. Not realizing that, that's straddling that sweet spot. So if you're asking for permission, you're not making the decision. If you're asking for forgiveness, you already made the decision, and it might've been a poor decision at that. And you're completely missing, that sweet spot. So the thing is, as we have progressed people up the ladder, making sure 4 doesn't turn into 6, with somebody just leapfrogging right over the 5th rung on the ladder.
So during the last 5 years or so, there's been some changes in the organization, and your role has evolved, and you've moved up, if I can use that language.
Mm-hmm.
And in your place, you've brought in people who were in the team already. I'm interested in terms of how far the intent-based approach helped you with that thinking, both in terms of developing those team members, but also giving them guidance around what you expected of them as leaders.
Yeah, it hasn't been by design, but it has worked out well that those individuals that, that you worked with back in 2020, several of them have advanced not only within the business that I used to look after, but also the other couple of businesses that I now, look after as well. So bringing, pushing that would have been one of my regrets. I wish I would have done a better job at trying to really push IBL across my peer group back in 2020, but it's worked out. But I'll tell you, to me, what's emerged, the people that have put themselves in a position to advance, take on bigger roles, lead some of these businesses, it's a function of the way they led. It's a function of what we worked through in 2020 as a case team, what we worked through as a larger management team back in 2022. So those that participated in the work in 2020 got to revisit some of it in 2022. And I don't think it's coincidence that those are the individuals that have put themselves in a position to advance and lead because of the style, because of adopting the principles and working and practicing. A little bit of the challenge we face is even then. So now we're talking about a much larger commercial team that's practicing IBL daily. It's not necessarily matched in maybe some of the other areas of the organization. So a little bit of a disconnect there, but it's taken hold. JC's doing her best.
So thinking about the impact overall from a business perspective, what are you able to share with us in terms of the benefit that you've seen of adopting the intent-based approach? Because for me, you've been very consistent about it. This was a decision you made and it's been with you and you've kind of had an unwavering commitment towards it. So I'm assuming that you've seen the impact of that. You've seen that playing out in terms of how the business works, and wondered whether you can share a little bit more about.
Yeah. Well, kind of going back, you stated it well for me earlier in terms of the competitive advantage that I felt we had 5 years ago. And while that still exists, we've gotten bigger and, closed the gap a little bit on some of our worthy rivals. But what we're seeing this year is, in continued difficult, difficult selling environment, at least on the industrial side of what we do. We're winning, and we know plenty of feedback coming from our principals. A lot of our peers are publicly owned, so we know exactly what kind of year they're having, and we're winning. It is a function of the speed that we continue to add as far as decision making. The other thing that comes with this, our retention rate is upwards of 95% on a rolling 18-month average. And we've been monitoring that. That's a corporate-wide KPI, but we've been monitoring that now for 3 years. I mean, just the sense of ownership that, people have, particularly salespeople have, but really knowing that, I mean, to me, it's a leadership philosophy, but I'm finding that it's absolutely a retention tool if you can really practice this and you can be sincere about it. Salespeople that maybe worked elsewhere, that needed everybody to sign off on making decisions come here and like, wow, like I'm actually adulting here. I'm being treated as an adult, and how refreshing it is. And then for those that have been here a while, getting back to what they remembered 10 or 12 years ago. And then we kind of morphed to a point where they're like, man, it doesn't seem like we get to make any decisions around here. Now they're like, okay, this is how I remember it being. This is why I joined this company. So that retention piece has been really important.
So there's something really interesting there in a sales environment context where I guess the traditional assumption would be, how do we drive performance? Well, we're going to use the extrinsic motivators in terms of benefits, comp, and so forth. What I hear you saying is actually there's a balance between that, the extrinsic, and the intrinsic. Yeah, but how much control do I have? How much choice do I have? How much trust do I have? How do I enjoy working with other people? Which, in a really fascinating from a sales perspective, becomes as important from a retention issue.
I mean, stereotypes exist for a reason, right? They're anchored to an extent in truth. And the vast majority of our team is very extrinsically motivated.
Yep.
Great. If you can augment that, by catering to their intrinsic motivation, it's game changing. Yeah.
Yeah. So that could be actually the difference, because I guess in a sales industry or a distribution sector, you can kind of compete or you can match and see what others are doing from a benefits perspective. It's much more difficult to match from a culture perspective.
Exactly. 100%. Yeah. We've been fortunate to recruit some highly talented sales people from competitors, and it's what they notice most about selling here, working here versus where they came from.
So for you personally, what do you think has changed most for you as a leader as a result of using the intent-based approach?
Well, I think I don't know if I'm going to answer the question in terms of exactly what you might be seeking, but short of what I've already shared, I think that if I think of tools that I use that I probably would have never used if it weren't for intent-based leadership. One is the intentional curating of dissent. I did this really well in 2020 and 2021. I got away from it. And over the last year, I've gotten better at, not artificially creating dissent, but, but asking individuals to come to meetings and play that role. Listen for groupthink, listen for consensus building, and some of the team members, and we have some team members that are well suited to play the role. So that's something that I have found incredibly valuable to continue to pull out, again, where everybody seems to be thinking the same way, trying to hit the pause button and redirect and say, hey, there's got to be some alternative views on this thing. And then as it relates to psychological safety, the tools that we learned, it's great. Fist to five gets used all over the place now, which is great. So yeah, I would say that the tools, one, some, all, I see used throughout, not just me. When I look at the guys that I work with that are running these businesses and they pull their teams together, they incorporate one, some, all into a lot of what they do. So that's probably the one principle. Leaders make it safe, not add stress. That's probably the principle that rises to the top across the company in terms of where the most attention is being paid and where the most time is being spent is on that psychological safety aspect.
And I guess the logic of that is that unless that foundation is in place, then asking people to step up, whether it's about making decisions or contributing or dissenting in meetings or reviewing when something hasn't gone well, if that psychological safety isn't in place, it's going to be really difficult to have anything meaningful by way of conversation.
Right. And, I think it's been a function of some of the changes that we've made organizationally over the last 4 or 5 years, as far as, changes at the top and a new CEO comes in, particularly from the outside, an unknown entity, all of a sudden it's like, man, I don't know this person. So I'm just keeping my mouth shut. Back, end of 22 into 2023, we got all over that, and did our level best to make sure that, hey, we've got to continue to push, psychological safety across the organization because of, the change in leadership.
I mean, there's no shortage of advice about leading businesses and how to manage businesses. And I suspect there's something like 10,000 books published every year about on the subject of leadership. So it's easy to get into a kind of cycle of picking up the latest idea and just going with that. I'm interested in what has kept your commitment and how you've kept that commitment to this particular approach rather than saying, oh yeah, we did that back in 2020, now we moved on to something else. What's been important in maintaining your use of the intent-based approach?
Well, for me, I guess unknowingly, I kind of prescribed to the latter before I met IBL. That was my style. My style was putting people in position to go out and do what I knew they could do, being there to support, but kind of just nudging them. Like, again, I didn't know it at the time, but I think, innately I was always nudging people up the ladder. It was maybe a little bit easier to do that early on in my career at Palmer Holland, and with the growth, we, obviously it's why we engaged with you guys there, but I mean, it works. It absolutely works. And the time that it's freed up for me to work on more value added stuff, the kind of stuff that only I can work on, or only I should be working on, in terms of uniquely qualified here at Palmer, and allowing everybody else to go do what they do best. But I to me, it's, when you see it working in action, everybody has a stereotype in their brain of what the military is like, and, a few good men, right? You follow orders, right? It's from the top down. And the story is just fascinating to me, to embed this type of leadership within the US military. That to me is what captivated me from the jump. There are a couple of pitfalls, I guess I would say, that I have found here, and witnessed. I've seen plenty of control given without either the proper clarity being provided from leadership or confirming that the competency was there. I mean, I've seen here with our growth, we added almost 70 people to our organization. So in pretty tough economic conditions, we doubled down and reinvested, the profits of the business from the previous couple of years. So you bring in all this talent, and sure, they're on their resume, they're capable and they've got some good work experience, but it takes a while to get to know Palmer. And seeing leaders, push control down to new team members way before they were competent, not intelligent, right? Not competency, high IQ, but hadn't worked here long enough. So I've seen that. The second is convincing some that the fifth rung on the ladder is just not semantics, that it's not a rubber stamp. And if they're coming to me, I mean, actually, I'm the one making the decision. Like, no, you're not making the decision. And if that's how you feel, that's how your team member is probably feeling too. It's not semantical. They are making the decision. It's just another opportunity to create a conversation. So, I'm still working on a few people, but as leaders, this idea that I'm still approving it. Well, if you want to approve it, listen, as a leader, that's your call. You get to choose what decisions you make, but then you better be awfully clear, because if you're telling your team it's their decision, but then when they come to you, they clearly get the impression that it's your decision because you're telling me that at the end of the day, you still feel that you're the one approving it. You're not there yet. So those are just a couple of the gaps that I would say that I've seen and I've worked on over the last few years with others.
I remember very clearly at the start of our journey of working together. It was the last gig I did in person before COVID. And I guess it would have been very easy at that point, as the world became very peculiar and unknown, for everybody to kind of say, oh yeah, well, forget that. I mean, we've got other priorities. What would you say to leaders who are thinking about working with intent, but might say, not sure that this is the right time?
Yeah, I joke, hey, what would I have done differently? And I was like, well, I probably will let COVID blow through before we start. It's going to sound cliche, but it's kind of like a lot of things, right? Well, I want to lose a few pounds. I'm just, what, I got a bunch of this travel coming up, or I got a wedding, or no, listen, is there ever a right time? For me, I would tell anybody that's in a position to invest in IBL, if you're committed to it, if you're committed and you understand it and you say, this is something that our organization needs, the sooner you can get started, the better. That's all I'll say. The longer you wait, it's like investing in a 401k. The longer you wait, the longer it's going to take for your organization, to see the impact. Life's a priority management issue. So you either make it a priority for your organization or for your team, or you don't. And if you've checked all the boxes and said to yourself, man, we need this, I would just say, let's go, rip the Band-Aid off and get started.
And let's imagine we're in that metaphorical bar and somebody sits next to you and says, you're the guy that I saw on that intent-based leadership podcast. Give me 1 minute as to why should I do it?
Great question from the standpoint, and talk about, you said 10,000 leadership books come out of here. Think about all the different leadership programs that are out there and how they advertise themselves and, increase productivity by this percent. And and I always say, how will you measure that? Like, how actually can you confirm that? And I would say, you can't. I couldn't sit here and tell you today that the success that this company has had over the last 5 years, I can draw, a direct correlation and say, this was the return on the investment that we made in 2020 and then in 2022. It's just, for me, it comes down to the confidence, that I see in our team, the trust, that I see across the board and in leadership that's there. That's another interesting thing that, we've spent a lot of time on, the difference between trust and confidence and delineating between the two. The word trust gets used instead of confidence way too often. All I can tell you is that both from a financial point of view and more importantly from a cultural point of view, IBL has been incredibly impactful for Palmer Holland. And, as long as I'm here, it will continue to be. And frankly, I think long after I'm gone, considering, how deep now and how broad, the principles have made it, across the organization, I think it's going to be, here for generations to come.
Well, that feels like a good moment to say thank you, Ron. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for sharing candidly your experience. And it's been a real pleasure to work with you and the team for the last 5 years and to see how the team has grown and embedded the intent-based approach. So thank you very much for being part of this growing community.
Well, and thank you. Thank you. And thank, the entire IBL team for bringing to Palmer Holland what you guys have. We're a better company for it. I'm a better leader for it. And, you can buy me lunch the next time you're in Northeast Ohio.